Chapter 16. With a forthright shriek of unoiled hinges, the church doors opened out of darkness into shadow, out of the cold night into the strange heat, out of the blustering storm into a quiet one, and a man entered the narthex. He didn't proceed stealthily or even with any noticeable caution, but walked directly to the nave arch, and with him came the rotten egg fumes from the vent pipe outside. It was P.J. He was wearing the same black boots, beige cords, and red cable-knit sweater that he had been wearing earlier in the evening back at the house at dinner, and later in the car when he had argued the merits of forgetfulness and brotherly bonds. Since then he had put on a black ski jacket. This was not the P.J. Shannon whose novels always found a home on the bestseller lists. Not the New Age Kerouac who had crossed the country uncounted times in various vans, motorhomes, and cars. This P.J. was still shy of his 24th birthday, a recent graduate of Notre Dame, home from his new job in New York publishing. He wasn't carrying the rifle with which he'd shot the Bimmers, and he didn't seem to think he needed it. He stood in the archway, feet planted wide, hands empty at his sides, smiling. Until now, Joey had forgotten the extreme confidence of P.J. at that age, the tremendous power that he radiated, the sheer intensity of his presence. The word charismatic had been overused even in 1975. By 1995, it was employed by journalists and critics to describe every new politician who had not yet been caught stealing, every new rap singer who thought hate rhymed with rape, every young actor with more smoldering in his eyes than in his brain. But whether in 1995 or 1975, the word seemed to have been invented for P.J. Shannon. He had all the charisma of an Old Testament prophet without the beard and robes, commanding attention sheerly by his presence, so magnetic that he seemed to exert an influence upon even inanimate objects, realigning all things around him until even the lines of the church's architecture subtly focused attention toward him. Meeting Joey's eyes across the length of the church, P.J. said, "Joey, you surprised me." With one sleeve, Joey blotted the sweat on his face, but he didn't reply. "I thought we had a bargain," said P.J. Joey put one hand on the shotgun which lay on the presbytery floor beside him, but he didn't pick it up. P.J. could dodge out of the archway and back into the narthex before Joey would be able to raise the gun and pump off a round. Besides, at that distance, mortal damage probably couldn't be done with a shotgun, even if P.J. failed to get out of the line of fire fast enough. "All you had to do was go back to college like a good boy, back to your job at the supermarket, lose yourself in the daily struggle of life, the gray, grinding boredom that you were born for, but you had to stick your nose in this." "You wanted me to follow you here," Joey said. "Well, true enough, little brother, but I was never sure you'd actually do it. You're just a little priest-loving, rosary-kissing altar boy. Why should I expect you to have any guts? I thought you might even go back to college and make yourself accept my cockamamie story about the mountain man up on Pine Ridge." "I did." "What?" "Once," Joey said. "But not this time." P.J. was clearly baffled. This was the first and only time that he would ever live through this strange night. Joey had been through a variation of it once before, and only Joey had been given a second chance to do it right. From the floor beside him, Joey scooped up the $30 and, still half sheltering behind the balustrade, threw it at P.J. Although wadded in a ball, the paper currency sailed only as far as the end of the choir enclosure and fell short of the sanctuary railing. "Take back your silver." For a moment, P.J. seemed stunned, and then he said, "What an odd thing to say, little brother." "When did you make your bargain?" Joey asked, hoping that he was right about P.J.'s psychotic fantasy and was playing into it in a way that would shake him out of his smug complacency. "Bargain?" P.J. asked. "When did you sell your soul?" Shifting his attention to Celeste, P.J. said, "You must have helped him puzzle it out. His mind doesn't have a dark bent that would let him see the truth on his own. Certainly not in the couple of hours since he opened my car trunk. You're an interesting young lady. Who are you?" Celeste didn't answer him. "The girl by the road," P.J. said. "I know that much. I would have had you by now if Joey hadn't interfered. But who else are you?" "Secret identities. Dual identities. Conspiracies." PJ was indeed operating in the complex and melodramatic world of a paranoid psychotic with religious delusions, and he evidently believed that he saw in Celeste some otherworldly presence. She remained silent, crouching by the balustrade, one hand on her shotgun which lay on the presbytery floor. Joey hoped she wouldn't use the weapon. They needed either to lure PJ further into the church within range, or they needed to convince him that they didn't need guns at all and felt confident about trusting in the power of the holy ground on which they stood. "Know where the $30 came from, Joey?" PJ asked. "From Beverly Korshak's purse. Now I'll have to gather it up and put it in your pocket again, later. Preserve the evidence." At last, Joey understood what role PJ had in mind for him. He was expected to take the fall for everything his brother had done, and would do, this night. No doubt his own murder would have been made to look like suicide. Priest-loving, rosary-kissing altar boy flips out, kills 12 in satanic ceremony, takes own life, film at 11. He had escaped that fate 20 years ago when he had failed to follow PJ onto Coal Valley Road, but he'd taken a turn into another destiny that had been nearly as bad. This time he had to avoid both those options. "You asked when I sold my soul," PJ said, still lingering in the narthex archway. "I was 13. You were 10. I got hold of these books about Satanism, the Black Mass. Neat stuff. I was ripe for them, Joey. Held my funny little ceremonies in the woods, small animals on my little altar in the woods. I was ready to slit your throat, kiddo, and cut your heart out if nothing else had worked, but it didn't come to that. It was so much easier than that. I'm not even sure the ceremonies were necessary, you know. I think all that was necessary was to want it badly enough. Wanting it with every fiber of my being, with all my heart, wanting it so badly that I hurt with wanting it. That's what opened the door and let him in." "Him," Joey said. "Satan. Scratch, the devil. Spooky old Beelzebub," said PJ, in a jokey and theatrical tone of voice. "Boy, he's not at all like that, Joey. He's actually a warm, fuzzy old beast. At least to those who embrace him." Though Celeste remained crouched behind the balustrade, Joey rose to his full height. "That's right, kiddo," PJ encouraged. "Don't be afraid. Your big brother won't spout green fire out his nose or sprout leathery wings." Desert dry heat was still coming through the floor. Like ectoplasmic faces pressed to the glass, condensation began to form on some of the windows. "Why did you do it, PJ?" Joey asked, pretending to believe in such things as souls and bargains with the devil. "Oh, kiddo, even then I was sick to death of being poor. Afraid of growing up to be a useless piece of shit like our old man. Wanted money in my pocket, cool cars when I got old enough for them, my pick of the girls. And there was no way that was ever going to happen to me like I was. Not when I was just one of the Shannon boys living in a room next to the furnace. But after I made the deal, well, look what happened. Football star, top grades in my class, most popular boy in school. Girls couldn't wait to spread their legs for me, and even after I'd dump one of them, she'd still love me, moon over me, never say a word against me. Then a full scholarship to a Catholic university. And how's that for irony?" Joey shook his head in denial. "You were always a good athlete, even as a kid, and real smart, and everyone always liked you. You always had those things, PJ." "The hell I did," PJ said, raising his voice for the first time. "God gave me nothing when I came into this world. Nothing. Nothing but crosses to bear. He's a great advocate of suffering, God is. A real sadist. I had nothing until I made a deal for it." Reason and logic would have no effect on him, especially not if his psychosis had taken root when he'd been a child. He was a long time gone into madness. The only hope of manipulating him into a disadvantageous position was to play into his fantasy, encourage him. PJ said, "Why don't you try it, Joey? You won't have to learn a lot of chants, conduct ceremonies in the woods, none of that. Just want it. Open your heart to it. And you can have your own companion." Companion? Like I have Judas, a rider on the soul. I invited him into me. I let him out of hell for a while, and in return he takes good care of me. He has big plans for me, Joey. Wealth, fame. He wants me to satisfy every desire I have, because he experiences everything through me, feels the girls through me, tastes the champagne, shares the sense of power, the glorious power when it's time to kill. He wants only the very best for me, Joey, and he makes sure that I get it. You could have a companion of your own, kiddo. I can make it happen. I really can. Joey was rendered speechless by the astonishing complexity of PJ's twisted fantasy of Faustian bargains, negotiated damnation, and possession. If he had not spent 20 years reading about the most exotic cases of aberrant psychology ever published, he could not have begun to grasp the nature of the human monster with whom he was dealing. He could not possibly have understood PJ the first time that he'd lived through this night, because then he had lacked the special knowledge that allowed him to comprehend. PJ said, "You have to want it, Joey. Then we kill this bitch here. One of the Dolan boys is 16, big kid. We can make it look like he did it all, then killed himself. You and me, we walk away, and from now on we're together, tighter than brothers, together like we've never been before." What do you really need me for, PJ? Hey, I don't need you, Joey. I'm not out to use you for any reason. I just love you. Don't you think I love you? I do. You're my baby brother. Aren't you my one and only little baby brother? Why shouldn't I want to have you at my side, share my good fortune with you? Joey's mouth was dry, and not just from the sudden heat. For the first time since turning off the county route onto Coal Valley Road, he longed for a double shot of Jack Daniels. I think you just need me to take down the crucifix for you. Maybe hang it upside down instead of the way it is. PJ didn't respond. I think you're desperate to finish the little tableau that you started to set up here, but now you're afraid to come into the church since we've restored things. You haven't restored anything, PJ said scornfully. I bet if I took down the crucifix, blew out the candles, tore up the altar, if I just made the place safe for you again, then you'd kill both of us, just like you planned all along. Hey, kiddo. Don't you see who you're talking to? This is your brother here. What's wrong with you? Am I your brother? The one who always fought all your fights with you? Took good care of you? Am I ever going to hurt you? Hurt you? Does that make any sense at all? Celeste rose from her knees to stand beside Joey, as though she sensed that any small show of courage on her part would help convince PJ that she and Joey were confident about the protection provided by the symbols with which they had surrounded themselves. Their confidence might feed his apprehension. If you're not afraid of the church, why won't you come farther in? Joey asked. Why is it so warm in here? PJ tried to sound as self-assured as always, but doubt tainted his voice. What's there to be afraid of? Nothing. Then come on in. There's nothing sacred here. Prove it. Put your fingers in the holy water. PJ turned his attention to the marble font at his right side. It was dry before. You put the water there yourself. Did we? It hasn't been blessed, PJ said. You're not a damn priest. It's just ordinary water. Then put your fingers in it. Joey had read of psychotics who, swept away by delusions that they possessed satanic power, were capable of literally blistering when they put their fingers into holy water or touched a crucifix. The injuries they suffered were real, although induced entirely by their own powers of suggestion, by the depth of their belief in their own sick fantasies. When PJ continued to regard the shallow pool of holy water with trepidation, Joey said, Go on. Touch it. Go on. Or are you afraid it'll eat into your hand, burned like an acid? PJ reached hesitantly toward the marble bowl. Like a nervous dragonfly, his spread fingers hovered over the water. Then he pulled his hand back. Jesus, Celeste said softly. They had found a way to use PJ's madness to protect themselves from him. The first time that he had lived through this night, Joey had been little more than a boy, just out of his teens, up against not merely an older brother, but a psychopath of extreme cunning and high intelligence. Now he had 20 years of experience on PJ, which gave him the psychological advantage this time. "You can't touch us," Joey said. "Not here in this sacred place. You can't do anything that you plan to do here, PJ. Not now. Not since we've let God back inside these walls. All you can do now is run for it. Morning will roll around eventually, and we'll just wait here until someone comes looking for us, or until someone finds the Bimmers." PJ tried again to put his hand in the water, but he couldn't do it. Crying out wordlessly in fear and frustration, he kicked the font. The wide marble bowl crashed off the fluted pedestal, and PJ took sufficient courage from that destruction to rush forward into the nave while the font was still toppling. Joey stooped and reached for the 20 gauge. Even as the contents of the bowl spilled onto the floor, PJ stepped into the spreading puddle, and a cloud of sulphurous steam erupted around his feet, as if the water had indeed been blessed, and had reacted with fierce corrosive power upon encountering the shoe of a demon-ridden man. Joey realized that the floor must have been much hotter at the back of the nave than in the sanctuary, fearfully hot. Having noticed the extreme and increasing heat in the church, PJ should have realized as much himself. However, in his dementia, he reacted not with reason, but with superstitious panic. The gush of steam from the holy water reinforced his bizarre delusion, and he screamed as if he'd actually been burned. In fact, he surely was suffering, because to anyone afflicted with psychosomatic pain, it seemed as genuine as the real thing. PJ let out a shriek of abject misery, slipped and fell in the water, into more steam, landing hard on his hands and knees, wailing, squealing. He raised his hands, fingers smoking, and then put them to his face, but tore them away at once, as though the beads of water on them were indeed the tears of Christ and were searing his lips, his cheeks half blinding him. He thrashed to his feet, stumbled out of the nave into the narthex, to the front doors, into the night, alternately shouting in rage and bleating in purest anguish, like neither a man nor a man possessed, but like a wild beast in excruciating torment. Joey had only half raised the Remington. PJ had never come close enough to warrant the use of the gun. "My God," Celeste said shakily. "That was amazing luck," Joey agreed. But they were talking about different things. She said, "What luck?" "The hot floor. It's not that hot," she said. He frowned. "Well, it must be a lot hotter back there than at this end of the building. In fact, I'm wondering how long we'll even be safe here." "It wasn't the floor. You saw. It was him." Him? She was as deathly pale as one of the distorted, ghostly faces of condensation on the church windows. Staring at the shallow puddle that was still lightly steaming at the far end of the center aisle, she said, "He couldn't touch it. Wasn't worthy." "No. Nonsense. It was just the hot floor meeting the cool water steam." She shook her head vigorously. "Corrupt. Couldn't touch something holy. Celeste. Corrupt. Foul. Tainted." Worried that she was on the brink of hysteria, he said, "Have you forgotten?" Celeste met his eyes, and he saw such an acute awareness in her that he dismissed all concerns about panic attacks and hysteria. In fact, there was a curiously humbling quality about her piercing stare. She'd forgotten nothing. Nothing. And he sensed that her perception was, in fact, clearer than his. Nevertheless, he said, "We put the water in the font." "So?" "Not a priest." "So?" "We put it there, and it's just ordinary water." "I saw what it did to him." "Just steam." "No, Joey. No, no." She spoke rapidly, running sentences together, frantic to convince him. "I got a glimpse of his hands, part of his face. His skin was blistered red and peeling. The steam can't have been that hot. Not off a wooden floor." "Psychosomatic injury," he assured her. "No. The power of the mind, auto-hypnosis." "There's not much time," she said urgently, looking around at the crucifix and then at the candles, as if to make sure that their stage setting was still in order. "I don't think he'll be back," Joey said. "He will." "But when we played straight into his fantasy, we scared the bejesus." "No. He can't be frightened. Nothing can scare him." Even in her urgency, she seemed mildly dazed, in shock. But Joey was overcome by the odd certainty that she was not distracted as she seemed, but was functioning at a level of awareness and with a degree of insight that he had never known. Heightened perceptions. She crossed herself. "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti." She was spooking Joey worse than PJ had done. A homicidal psychotic, Joey said nervously, is full of rage, sure, but he can be as susceptible to fear as any sane person. Many of them... No, he's the father of fear. Many of them live in constant terror. The father of lies. Such inhuman fury. Even when they're on power fantasies like he is, they live in fear of fury driving him for eternity. Her expressive eyes were glazed, haunted. He never gives up. Never will. Nothing to lose. In a perpetual state of hatred and rage ever since the fall. Joey glanced toward the spilled water in which PJ had slipped. The church was hotter than ever, sweltering, but steam had stopped rising from the puddle. Anyway, that wasn't the fall she meant. After a hesitation, he said, "Who are we talking about, Celeste?" She appeared to be listening to voices that only she could hear. "He's coming," she whispered tremulously. "You're not talking about PJ, are you?" "He's coming." "What? Who?" "The companion." "Judas." "There's no Judas. That's fantasy." "Beyond Judas." "Celeste, be serious. The devil himself isn't really in PJ." As alarmed by his insistence on reason as he was alarmed by her sudden descent into full-blown mysticism, she gripped him by the lapels of his denim jacket. "You're running out of time, Joey. Not much time left to believe. I believe not in what matters." She let go of him, vaulted over the presbytery balustrade into the choir enclosure, landing solidly on both feet. "Celeste!" Rushing to the sanctuary gate, she shouted, "Come, touch the floor, Joey. Touch where the water spilled. See whether it's hot enough for steam. Hurry!" Frightened for her, frightened by her, Joey also vaulted the balustrade. "Wait!" She shoved through the sanctuary gate. Over the incessant drumming of the rain on the roof, another sound arose, an escalating roar, not from under them, outside. She hurried into the center aisle. He looked toward the windows on the left, toward the windows on the right, darkness to both sides. "Celeste!" he shouted as he pushed through the sanctuary gate. "Show me your hands!" She was halfway down the aisle. She turned toward him. Her face was slick with sweat, like a ceramic glaze, glistening with candlelight. The face of a saint, a martyr. The roar swelled, an engine, accelerating. "Your hands!" Joey shouted desperately. She raised her hands. In her delicate palms were hideous wounds, black holes, thick with blood. From out of the west, shattering windows, smashing through clapboard and wall studs, and old wood paneling and stations of the cross, the Mustang exploded into the church, headlights unlit, but engines screaming, horns suddenly blaring, tires popping like balloons as the floor splintered under them, driving forward with tremendous power, plowing into the pews, unstoppable. Those benches cracked free of their moorings, tilted up, slammed into one another, pews and kneelers erupting and crashing together and piling one atop the next in a cresting wave of wood, in a geometry of penitence. And still the Mustang surged forward, engine racing, gears grinding, trumpeting as it came. Joey fell to the floor in the center aisle and shielded his head with his folded arms, certain that he was going to die in the tsunami of pews. He was even more certain that Celeste would die, whether crushed to death now or later after being nailed to the floor or to the wall by PJ. Joey had utterly failed her, failed himself. Following the storm of broken glass, the hail of plaster, the avalanche of wood, there would be a rain of blood. Over the roar of the Mustang, over the banshee horn, over the crack-split shatter of wood, over the ringing of falling glass, over the ominous creak of sagging ceiling beams, he heard one special sound, separate and eerily distinct from all others, and instantly he knew what it was. The bronze clatter and thud of the crucifix dropping off the back wall of the sanctuary. Chapter 17. The cold wind was in the church now, sniffing and panting like a pack of dogs through the ruins. Joey lay face down under a stack of tumbled pews and shattered wall beams, and although he felt no pain, he was afraid that his legs were crushed. When he dared to move, however, he discovered that he was neither injured nor pinned in place. The rubble was a multi-tiered, three-dimensional maze. Joey was forced to crawl, writhe, and squirm through it as though he were a rat-seeking ferret exploring the depths of an ancient timber fall. Shingles, lath, and chunks of other debris still dropped out of the demolished wall and from the damaged ceiling, clattering into the wreckage. The wind played the narrow, twisting passages in the destruction as though they were flutes, piping an eerie, tuneless music. But the car engine had died. After wriggling through an especially cramped space between slabs of prayer-polished oak, Joey came to the front wheel of the Mustang. The tire was flat and the fender had crumpled around it like paper. From the undercarriage, greenish antifreeze drizzled like dragon's blood. The radiator had burst. He squeezed farther along the side of the car. Just past the driver's door, he reached a place where he was able to stand up between the vehicle and the surrounding rubble. He hoped to see his brother dead in the Mustang, the shaft of the steering wheel driven through his chest by the impact, or his body pitched halfway through the windshield, but the driver's door was open just wide enough to allow escape, and PJ was gone. "Celeste!" Joey shouted. No answer. PJ would be looking for her. "Celeste!" He smelled gasoline. The fuel tank had burst. The surrounding pews and slabs of wood paneling and sheared-off 2x4s had tilted up higher than the car. He couldn't see much of the church. Joey levered himself onto the roof of the Mustang. He rose to his feet, turning his back to the damaged wall in the rain/night. St. Thomas's was filled with strange light and swarming shadows. Some ceiling bulbs were still on, but others were out. Toward the rear of the church, showers of white, gold, blue sparks cascaded from a damaged overhead fixture. In the sanctuary, the candles had toppled when the building had been shaken by the impact of the hurtling car. The sheets on the altar platform were afire. Shuttling, weaving shadows made a fabric of confusion, but one among them moved with a linear purpose that snapped Joey's attention to it. Coming off the ambulatory into the presbytery was PJ. He was carrying Celeste. She was unconscious, cradled in his arms, head tilted back, tender throat exposed, black hair trailing almost to the floor. Christ, no! For an instant, Joey couldn't breathe. Then he was gasping. He plunged off the roof of the Mustang onto the crumpled hood and clambered up from the car onto the surrounding jumble of pews and beams and buckled wallboard. The wreckage shifted under him, threatening to open and swallow him in a maw of wickedly splintered boards and twisted nails, but he kept moving, wobbling and lurching, arms spread like those of a lumberjack trying to maintain his balance in a log-rolling contest. At the 3 altar steps, PJ ascended. The back wall of the sanctuary without crucifix crawled with images of fire. Joey jumped down from the pile of rubble into an open space in front of the sanctuary railing. On the altar, PJ dropped Celeste onto the burning sheets, as though she were not a person, a special and needed person, but only an armful of trash. "No!" Joey shouted, leaping across the sanctuary railing, stumbling into the curving ambulatory that would take him around the choir and up to the high altar. Her raincoat caught fire. He saw the flames leap hungrily from that new fuel. Her hair! Her hair! Stung by the flames, she regained consciousness and screamed. Rounding the ambulatory, reaching the presbytery walkway, Joey saw PJ standing over Celeste on the burning sheets, oblivious of the fire around his feet, hunched like some round-backed beast, the hammer in one hand and raised high to strike. With his heart knocking as loud as death's fist on a door, Joey crossed the presbytery toward the altar steps. The hammer arced down. Her cry of terror, heart-piercing, cut off by the sound of the steel hammer crushing her skull. A bleat of misery tore free of Joey as he reached the foot of the altar steps. PJ whipped around. "Little brother!" He was grinning, eyes a-dance with reflections of fire, face blistered by water burns. He triumphantly raised the blood-wet hammer. "Now let's nail her down." "No!" Something fluttered across Joey's vision. No, not a cross. The flutter wasn't anything in the church, nothing real, behind his eyes. Like a darting shadow of wings on rippled sun-spangled water. Everything had changed. The fire was gone. So was PJ. The crucifix hung on the back wall again. The candles were all upright, the makeshift altar cloth unburned. Celeste grabbed him by the shoulder, spun him, seized the lapels of his denim jacket. He gasped in surprise. She said, "You're running out of time, Joey. Not much time left to believe." He heard himself say, "I believe." "Not in what matters," she interrupted. She let go of him and vaulted over the presbytery balustrade into the choir enclosure, landing solidly on both feet. There was as yet no ragged breach in the west wall. The Mustang had not yet exploded into the church. Replay. Joey had been thrown back in time again, not 20 years as before, only a minute, 2 minutes at most, a chance to save her. He's coming. "Celeste!" Running to the sanctuary gate, she shouted, "Come touch the floor, Joey. Touch where the water spilled. See whether it's hot enough for steam. Hurry!" Joey put a hand on the balustrade, ready to vault across it and go after her. No. Do it right this time. Last chance. Do it right. Celeste shoved through the sanctuary gate. Over the incessant drumming of the rain on the roof, another sound arose. An escalating roar. The Mustang. He's coming. With a terrifying conviction that he was wasting precious seconds and that this replay was running faster than the original event, Joey snatched the 20-gauge shotgun from the presbytery floor. Celeste hurried into the center aisle. He shouted frantically, "Get out of the way! The car!" as he hurtled over the balustrade with a shotgun in one hand. She was halfway down the aisle as she had been the first time. She turned as before. Her face was slick with sweat, like a ceramic glaze, glistening with candlelight. The face of a saint. A martyr. The roar of the Mustang swelled. Puzzled, she half-turned toward the windows, raising her hands. In her delicate palms were hideous wounds, black holes thick with blood. "Run!" he shouted, but she froze where she was. This time he didn't even reach the sanctuary railing before the Mustang slammed through the west wall of the church. A tidal wave of glass and wood and plaster and broken pews crested before the running horse hood ornament, washed back along both fenders until the car was all but hidden in the debris. A length of board spinning like a martial arts weapon whistled through the air, hit Celeste, and knocked her to the floor more than halfway down the center aisle, which was something that Joey hadn't been able to see from his previous vantage point, the first time that he had lived through the crash. With a double bang of blowing tires, the car came to a halt in steepled rubble, and even above the clatter of the last tumbling pews, Joey heard the curiously separate and distinct clank of the bronze crucifix falling off the back wall of the sanctuary. Instead of lying half-trapped under the destruction in the nave as before, he was still in the sanctuary, untouched by anything other than the cloud of pale dust that the incoming wind swept out of the ruins, and this time he was armed. Chambering a shell in the 20-gauge Remington, he kicked through the sanctuary gate. The wreckage was still settling, and debris was falling from the corner of the roof that had sagged inward when the supports had been knocked from under it. The amount of residual noise was greater than it had seemed to Joey when he had been lying under the ruins, but then he had been half-dazed. As far as he was able to discern, the destruction had fallen into precisely the same patterns as before. The Mustang could still not be approached easily or directly. He could see only sections of it through gaps in the ruins. He had to do it right this time. No mistakes. Finish him off. Toting the gun, Joey climbed onto the precariously stacked pews. They creaked and groaned, wobbled and shuddered, treacherous beneath him. Wary of protruding nails and glass daggers, he nevertheless clambered quickly across upturned benches, splintered window frames, cracked 2x4s, and slabs of wallboard, reaching the car much faster than when he'd had to snake his way to it from the bottom of the rubble. Even as he jumped down from a pew onto the Mustang, he fired a round from the shotgun into the pitch-dark interior of the car. He wasn't well balanced, and the recoil nearly knocked him off his feet, but he stayed upright, pumped the Remington, fired again, and a third time, filled with savage judgmental glee, confident that PJ could not have lived through that storm of buckshot. The 3 shots were thunderous, and in the fading echo of the third he heard a movement behind him that didn't sound like merely another settling noise, that seemed to be more purposeful. It was impossible that PJ could have gotten out of the car before Joey arrived this time. Impossible that he could have both gotten out and circled around behind. Joey started to turn, looking back and up, and beheld the impossible from the corner of his eye. PJ was right there, coming down on him, descending the precarious woodpile with daunting agility, swinging a length of 2x4. The flat of the heavy club struck Joey hard along the right temple. He fell onto the car hood, losing his grip on the shotgun, instinctively rolling away from his assailant, drawing his knees up and tucking his head down in the fetal position. The second blow smashed the ribs along his left side and drove all the breath out of him. Wheezing for air, getting none, he rolled again. The third blow landed on his back, and a scintillant pain coruscated along his spine. He rolled through the shot-out windshield, over the dashboard, into the front seat of the dark Mustang, and from there dropped into a far deeper, more profound blackness. When he came around, rising out of a cloistered inner space of softly scurrying midnight spiders, he was certain that he'd been unconscious for only a few seconds, surely less than a minute. He was still struggling mightily to breathe, sharp pain in his ribs, the taste of his own blood. Celeste. Sliding through gummy safety glass and buckshot, Joey pulled himself behind the steering wheel. He pushed the door open as far as the embracing rubble would allow, but that was far enough to get out into the October wind and the flickering light. Toward the narthex and the overturned holy water font, sparks cascaded from a ceiling fixture. In the other direction, orange reflections of fire and shadows of flames slithered up the back wall of the sacristy, but he couldn't see the blaze itself through the encircling ruins. Having taken the first blow from the 2x4 on the right side of his head, he had little vision in that eye. Blurred shapes throbbed and swarmed among twinkling phantom lights. He smelled gasoline. He dragged, lever-kicked himself onto the roof of the Mustang. He was too dizzy to get all the way to his feet. On his knees he surveyed the church. With his left eye, he could see PJ ascending the altar steps with Celeste unconscious in his arms. The candles had toppled. The altar cloth was afire. Joey heard someone cursing, then realized that he was listening to his own voice. He was cursing himself. Cruelly dropping Celeste onto the seething altar platform, PJ snatched up the hammer. Joey heard sobbing where there had been cursing, and devastating pain detonated along his left side through his broken ribs. The hammer, raised high. Stung to wakefulness by the fire, Celeste screamed. From the altar platform, PJ peered across the church toward the Mustang, toward Joey, and his eyes were filled with jack-o'-lantern light. The hammer crashed down, a flutter, behind Joey's eyes, like a darting shadow of wings on rippled sun-spangled water, like the flight of angels half seen at the periphery of vision. Everything had changed. His ribs were no longer broken. His vision was clear. He had not yet been beaten by his brother. Rewind. Replay. Oh, Jesus. Another replay. One more chance. Surely it would be the last. And he hadn't been cast backward in time as far as he had been before. His window of opportunity was narrower than ever, giving him less time to think. His chances of altering their fate were poor because now he didn't have leeway for even a small error in judgment. The Mustang had already rammed into the church, the high altar was burning, and Joey was already scrambling across the steepled rubble, jumping down onto the hood of the car, squeezing the trigger on the Remington. He checked himself just in time to avoid his previous mistake, whirled and fired up instead at the jumbled pews behind him, from which PJ had attacked him with the 2x4. The buckshot shredded empty air. PJ wasn't there. Confused, Joey turned to the car and blasted out the windshield as he had done before, but no scream came from inside, so he whipped around to cover his back again. PJ still wasn't coming at him with the 2x4. Jesus! Screwing up again, screwing up, doing the wrong thing again. Think! Think! Celeste. She was all that mattered. Forget about taking PJ. Just get to Celeste before he does. Carrying the shotgun with him even though it inhibited movement, Joey scrambled up the tilted pews and kneelers, across the rubble toward the rear of the nave, down again into the center aisle where he'd seen Celeste knocked unconscious by the spinning chunk of wood. She wasn't there. Celeste! In the sanctuary at the front of the church, a slouching figure hunched along the ambulatory, through the dervish reflections of the altar fire above. It was PJ. He was carrying Celeste. The center aisle was blocked. Joey ran between two rows of pews to the side aisle along the east wall of the church, and then raced forward along the unbroken panes of rain-beaten glass toward the sanctuary railing. Rather than proceeding to the altar as before, PJ disappeared with Celeste through the door to the sacristy. Joey leaped over the sanctuary railing, as though too eager to accept a proffered sacrament, and edged swiftly but warily along the wall to the sacristy. He hesitated at the doorway, fearful of stepping face first into a hard-swung 2x4 or a gun blast, but then he did what must be done, the right thing, and stepped up to the threshold. The sacristy door was closed, locked. He stepped back, aimed the shotgun. One round trashed the lock and blew the door open. The sacristy was deserted, except for Beverly Korshak's body, which lay in a corner, a pale mound in a plastic shroud. Joey went to the exterior door. It was secured with a deadbolt from the inside as he had left it. The cellar door. He opened it. In the moon-yellow light below, a serpentine shadow slithered into a coil and rolled out of sight around a corner. The stairs were unpainted wood, and in spite of every effort he made at stealth, his boots met every tread with a hollow knock like the deliberative countdown of a doomsday clock. Heat rose in parching currents and torrid waves and scorching tides, and by the time he reached the basement floor, he felt as if he were descending into a primal furnace. The air was redolent of superheated wood ceiling beams on the brink of charring, hot stone from the masonry walls, hot lime from the concrete floor, and a trace of sulfur from the mine fires below. When he stepped off the final wooden tread, Joey would not have been surprised if the rubber heels of his boots had melted on contact with the cellar floor. Sweat streamed from him, and his hair fell across his face in lank, dripping strands. The cellar appeared to be divided into several chambers that were separated by deep, offset archways, so it was impossible to see into one room from another. The first was illuminated only by a single bare, dust-caked bulb seated in a coffer between two beams that severely limited the spread of the light. A fat black spider, as if driven mad by the heat and sulphurous fumes, circled frenziedly around and around and around the crystal-glittering strands of its enormous web in the same coffer as the light bulb. Its exaggerated shadow jittered and stilted across the floor in a spiral that made Joey nauseous and dizzied him when he trod upon it as he headed toward the archway to the next room. Above ground, the structure had been a plain coal country church, but its masonry underpinnings were more formidable, seemed older than the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania itself, and had a Gothic weight that imprisoned his heart. Joey felt as though he had descended not only into St. Thomas's basement, but into haunted catacombs beneath Rome itself, one sea, one continent, one millennium away from Coal Valley. He paused long enough to reload the Remington with spare shells from his jacket pockets. As Joey entered the second room, the serpentine shadow shimmered away from him across the floor again, as though it were a stream of black mercury. It darkled out of the bile yellow light and around the corner of another archway into the next crypt. Because the slippery shade was PJ's shadow and bore with it the precious shadow of Celeste, Joey swallowed his fear and followed into a third vault, a fourth. Although none of those low-ceiling spaces was immense, the subterranean portion of the church began to seem vast, immeasurably larger than the humble realm above. Even if the basement architecture proved to be supernaturally extensive, however, he would arrive eventually at a final chamber where brother could come face to face with brother, and the right thing at last could be done. The cellar had no windows, no outside doors. Confrontation was inevitable.